This is something I wrote about my cat Ludo when he died. You'll have to forgive me, as a lot of these things happened over 10 years ago now, and whilst I consider myself to have a pretty good recollection of the details, there are so many of them. But your story is important to me, and now that you're gone, I'm left putting back together the fragments of what you left behind, knowing I'll never be able to recreate anything as perfect and unique, even if it became my life's purpose. There's a beauty in this sorrow, and some attempts to selfishly heal myself during this difficult time. I thought if I could put your life back together, even without you in it, I could still marvel at the beauty and the craftsmanship that you wielded in our time together. Whether you remember it or not, our time together started when I came to pick you up from Nina's ham. But my longing for you had started previously to this, when I'd been browsing information about available kittens. I'd arrived to Sweden on June the 10th, after a conversation with your first dad, in which he confessed he wasn't enjoying London. Too busy, too expensive, apartment was too cold, too damp, too mouldy. And he was right, but I knew no better. I'd agreed that after living together for a year in London, that I would be willing to try Stockholm for a year. He assured me that the living standards would be far more humane, the rental prices more reasonable, but most importantly, that I could have a little cat of my own. Now, unbeknownst to you, I used to lie awake at night wondering what life could be like after the move. I'd visited Sweden and made some friends here, but mostly I was trying to put pieces together and imagine how I might live. What would my apartment be like? And my cat? I'd always pictured myself owning a little grey cat called Mushroom, after a colleague had brought it up as a great name for a pet one day, and somehow in that moment I decided that I too would own a mushroom. Mushroom, as you know, did in fact turn out to be a little grey cat. She came from a farm in Skellefteå, from a surprise litter born to Riva after her last litter had come out at a time in which I hadn't secured a place for a cat to live yet. After turning up to Stockholm in June and moving in temporarily with your first daddy's wealthy but cold grandparents, he'd managed to secure a friend's little summer stuga for us to move into. It had been a childhood friend whose parents were willing to let us rent out the tiny little place, and whilst it was certainly a step towards independence for he and I, there was no way that I could have been that there would have been a suitable place for kittens. Although you would have loved it, without a doubt, close to the forest, by plenty of water, there were mice and spiders and all of those wonderful things that you would have appreciated, even if I couldn't. Even still, with the help of his grandfather, who happened to seem to be part of that older generation of Stockholm who knows anybody who's been around for long enough to pass down inheritance from father to son, we managed to get a rental contract in an apartment next to the motorway. I cannot even begin to describe the luxury of moving from damp mold in London to somebody else's home, even when you can't understand anything they say yet, to a little forest shack, to an entire apartment for yourselves. A warm, dry apartment with a living room, a bedroom, a couple of cupboards that had been converted into a bathroom, with a sink, a little shower, cupboard. As when the building had been built, I believe it was still the custom to have communal bathrooms in the cellar. I had started working at a hotel from that August as breakfast staff, up at 4 a.m., starting 6 a.m., and so finally I had everything I needed: somebody who loved me, a home, and a part time job that was as full time as they could get me to work without having to pay me full time wages. And so it was time for my little mushroom. As mentioned, Mushroom ended up coming from a surprise litter very soon after her previous litter, Reva's previous litter, in which she and her little ginger brother were born sometime in August, if I remember rightly. After she'd grown enough to leave her mother, she was flown down to Stockholm and she got to join our family. This is where my memory is a little hazy, but I remember I was overjoyed, and she was perfect. Light gray with her back black stripes and occasional orange patches, she turned out to be such a funny little creature. She would climb on my shoulders, onto my head, cling onto my hair as she tried to gain new perspectives an adventure as only young kittens quite have the courage to do. But as two people who were working every day, there was a sense of guilt and concern for her loneliness. Of course, as somebody who could quite simply age quite disgracefully in a house full of cats, as if she could, I was never going to be against the idea of getting her a friend or a sibling. But as two humans who had found that they were less lonely around each other, I think it struck us that it must be quite lonely being the only one of your kind, without even humans for company during the considerable chunks of the day. So I set to it looking for a little brother for our incredibly funny and cheeky mush cat. I believe at the time I checked shelters, but I found myself drawn back to Blocket, which people could often provide information about the kittens themselves, but also the cat parents, the homes they were used to, and what each perfect individual seemed to want, need, and prefer. I believe I sent off a few messages. Many kittens seemed to elude a pedigree trade, which I could not afford nor could justify financially, but also just I wasn't looking for a designer cat. I was looking for a little brother cat. You were born somewhere near Nina's Ham with two other kittens, both brothers, I believe. Whilst you were cream in colour, they were both red or ginger, and being offered for about 1,000 crowns. More than we'd paid for mushroom, but retrospectively did not feel unreasonable, given when we got to know you, you probably ate more than 1,000 crowns of food in your first week of eating solids. I had never been to Nina's Ham, and I remember it was late January, cold, there was snow on the ground outside. We'd bought a blanket to bring you home in, which probably wasn't the most responsible type of transport, but we turned up to find some young teenagers who brought you to meet us under their jumper, can you believe? We paid for you and rushed to bring you home. Studying you the whole way home got me curious. You had such a funny little face, even compared to Mushroom. You looked disproportionately wide, your feet were far too large for your body, and I couldn't wait to watch you grow into being, as I couldn't possibly picture how you'd be fully grown. You looked more like a baby fox than a baby cat to me. We brought you home and set you down to meet your big sister, and as many other sibling relationships tend to start off, she was not impressed. She hissed at you, angrily, and you ran to hide under the sofa, where you stayed for your first night. We'd made sure to show you where the food and the litter box was, of course. At least, to start with, the sofa was your safe space. And whereas a 5-month-old kitten, she was too large to be able to get to you. Of course, we sat down and explained to her about who you were, and that you'd arrived, as all babies do, after a trip to a magical place. None of that stalk nonsense. Over the next few weeks, she learned to tolerate you, and even accept you, even though you had no respect for her as a big sister. You ate all of the food with reckless abandon, and you had a bit too much energy compared to her more demure and sophisticated personality that had suddenly developed an aloof nature and matured out of nowhere. She still picked on you, of course. She was bigger than you, and felt like she needed the occasional reminder, as little brothers often do. But we did try to warn her that you would likely catch up one day, and she might consider a more diplomatic truce before that day came. Over time, as you grew, your hunger never ceased. At first, we thought perhaps being part of a litter meant you needed to be territorial about food. But after the days and weeks and months that followed, we realized it could also just be that you celebrated food in a way that not everybody does. Once you saw the food going into that bowl, nothing would get in your way, and you would eat as much and as quickly as you can, not leaving the bowl until you were a little barrel on legs. How you managed that without making yourself ill only can have been a skill or a trick that I still don't understand myself today. And whilst it was somewhat funny to watch, I was a little worried that you could be developing some territorial traits. It was around this time that I had handed in my notice at work. I'd been a bit irritated by managers calling in sick at weekends when we had known that they had been out the night before, or that staff tips were being used to cover mistakes or technical faults when the credit card machine stopped working. Anyway, I was able to spend more time working with you and developing our relationship and communication. You'd gotten into a tendency of asking for food more often than a little cat should, and so I took it as an opportunity to ask that to ask when you would like to be fed, that you sit at the bowl and wait for it to be put down. It didn't take you long to realize what sit meant, although your ability to realize that sitting was an action that needed to last more than a split second took a little more work. Through praise, excitement, mutual celebration, and me pretending that I didn't understand what you were asking for otherwise, you got really good at sitting and waiting for food. So good, in fact, that you wanted to start learning other commands to make me happy and excited. And in turn, you inspired Blue, Balana, and Kira much later on to also pick up these habits. And let's not forget the walks, but we'll get to that soon enough. As I continued the pleasure of getting to know you, I learned that you love to play and you like to challenge. At the place next to Nina's Vegan, as I mentioned, it was a bit of an old-fashioned place that was later updated to ensure that cupboard spaces were able to be used as tiny bathrooms. There were several instances in which I'd come into the bedroom and find you sitting on the top shelf of a wardrobe. At first, I assumed I have mu- I must I must have left the door open, and you found a way to leap in. I was concerned, but given your levels, I wasn't too surprised. I berated First Daddy into making sure that the door was always closed. And also, I tried to make sure I was double checking, but every time I came to the bedroom to find you on the top shelf. Eventually, I walked in and caught you in the act, realizing that where the towels were hung on the outside of the wardrobe door, you were running up them, using your legs to balance and push the door open away from the wardrobe and jumping inside, making yourself cozy on the top shelf. I think at the time I stepped into the role of an angry mother and suggested that you were misbehaving, but know that I was secretly impressed. That you had enough planning and foresight to achieve a goal I know many humans would have given up on. It also alerted me to the fact that perhaps your excess energy needed some challenging and mental stimulation. It was around Easter time that I'd realized this, and whether I brought the little fluffy Easter chicks for decoration or for some other reason I forget. But I learned pretty quickly that if I was going to have them around, you were going to find them and play with them. I still don't approve of you having them, as they are small plastic choking hazard, probably ingredients and dyes I cannot even pronounce, but my goodness, they seem to reignite an instinct in you. And so I started trying to put them in places you shouldn't have been able to reach them, and watching you solve it each time. When I hung one from a sturdy metal ball from the ceiling in the middle of the room, I thought I'd called your bluff, until you launched yourself at me in a very Hollywood-esque style and used my shoulder as a launch pad. I realized that you loved more than anything working as a team. Even last week, despite being unwell in an attempt to get my attention in a positive way, you stood behind me on my office chair during a meeting, your front paws on my shoulders the way that you would as if you were trying to climb me as support. Maybe, rather than attention, it was support that you were trying to force out of me, knowing that in the past, the times that you were on my shoulders was when we were working as a team. Were you asking for my support as a team member? Hmm. As we lived next to Nina's vegan, you had to stay indoors as an indoors cat at first. That being said, with all the energy you had and all the playing you got up to, we decided to buy you mushroom harnesses and leashes and give you a taste of the great outdoors away from the road. The first time we took you out, you were very unsure. What was grass? Why did all of these things smell so strange? And where was the best place to stealth crawl until you could hide out of the way? Mushroom was even less of a fan. She preferred to hide in my jumper. Grass was wet and unnecessary, and if she had to be outside, she wanted to be carried in a cozy hug, to peek out at the world rather than be a part of it. I couldn't fault her logic. But over time, you both got a little bit braver. When we ended up leaving our home by Nynäsvägen, it was because your dad and I had gotten married. We'd bought a little radhus, a little two-story home with some outdoor space closer to his family where he'd grown up. I'd not long started a new job for a games company, and I was feeling optimistic. After working as a year as custom service on an entry salary of 21,000 SEK before tax, discovering on arrival that I'd had to launch the UK division, tax requirements, product marketing, translations into local colloquial ESL dialects, launching early, putting together strategies for our own product branding, and supporting SEO through social media and reputable reviews, etc. I had been teased for being an idiot. I handed in my resignation at that role, a report of the sexist comments and racism in the office, and took on the role as a community manager elsewhere. Anyway, you weren't too happy that you had to stay inside at first. You were worried we were worried you might try and run back to our old home. You started protesting by peeing and marking in places that you knew you shouldn't. And when First Daddy confronted you, you apparently left at his legs and attacked him. Now then, he would have been the first to admit that he didn't really know how to interact with animals. So I'm guessing maybe there was a misunderstanding between you. You could have a bit of a temper and make a point of it, but I think it's one of the first times we lived somewhere you could see other cats outside. You were about 2 years old at this point, and after getting Mushroom pregnant a month about after about a month of moving into our new home, I realized it was probably time to recognize that you were a man now. A man that probably needed castrating. Hmm. The 21st of October, 2013, Mushroom had become a little barrel on legs. Because she was such a tiny cat naturally, it took some time to realize that the weight was maybe not being put on for winter, just to keep her warm. We took her to the vets that asked if she was pregnant, which we told she was clearly pregnant, and asked if the dad was a blood-related brother. Honestly, Ludo, I was just excited. And whilst they made it clear that it's not ethical, the vet made it clear that it's not ethical to allow cats to have kittens, as other people abandon their cats in shelters without much consideration, I was ready to keep our family together. They were your fuzzy little jelly beans. Mush Cat seemed very well and happy with her pregnancy, so I wasn't really worried. I was ready to step up. 17th of November, Mushroom climbed into bed with myself and Daddy. She lay under the covers between his legs and started to pant. Given that she was a very rotund little cat who was heavily pregnant, I didn't think too much of it at first until I realized it was time. The babies had picked the one day that Daddy was committed to going into work at a weekend, and he didn't feel like he could let down his career, which I wasn't happy about. It takes a team to make sure that everybody is safe during a delivery, but Mushroom and I made sure she was comfortable with towels. I called the vet. I was worried what to look out for in case something was to go wrong, but she gave birth to three very healthy little jelly beans. One that sadly died not long after birth. I don't know how you were feeling at the time. I think you were downstairs waiting on the news, but amongst us girls, it was an emotional roller coaster, and she was a champ. We set her up in the spare bedroom, making sure she had plenty of food and water on hand so she didn't have to leave them. And we checked in daily to weigh them to make sure they were putting on weight. I know you were a little confused as to why you weren't allowed to go into the room at first. If you remember rightly, when you first met the little critters, you hissed at them. Perhaps you'd been having doubts up until that point. Maybe it all got a little bit too real too quickly, and you felt the need to swear. Either way, I don't blame you. After that, you showed a lot of concern for Mushroom and our little jelly beans, who ended up being named after soup in honor of mushroom soup. Noodles, miso, and of course blueberry soup. We eventually moved the nursing box downstairs for her so she could be a little bit closer to other things that were going on. And you'd check in on her, groom her, help groom the little tykes. She started hiding them in different places, so we were never sure when they were going to show up. But we all pulled together as a team. As they got older, you were pretty patient with them, even though they had all clearly received your greedy kitten gene. You weren't territorial. You seemed to recognize that they were young and didn't know better. I started to see them try to emulate you sitting for food, or at least Blaubeer and Miso. Noodles was a little bit too Ludo, which was funny because whilst Miso and looked like Mushroom and Blaubeer, well, I'm not sure who he looked like, but Noodles looked just like you. Your creamy colorings and mushroom stripes. But your eyes. I know that because even now I get to see photos of him. As in the end, when they were ready to be rehomed, Misa went to a friend and colleague I'd made during my time as a customer service agent, and Nunu ended up living with one of my games producer friends. I wanted to keep an eye on them somehow. Blaubeer, or Blue Bear, as you know, stayed with us. He was the missing part of our family, and life felt good. One thing for certain, when we started living in a Radhus, you could play outside as much as you liked. You turned out to be quite a little hunter. Mostly mice, you realized that you could catch them, leave them outside the living room on the wood decking, or better still, you learned that you could climb the tree outside our bedroom, up to the window, which was often open in the summer. One morning, you brought us in some poor creature to try and sharpen our hunting skills, dropping it and running off to see if you'd been fed for breakfast, leaving us to manage the situation in your wake. The joke was on us, I suppose, as we did have to learn to improve our reactionary skills and our ability to spot slight movements. Luckily, we learned our lesson after that. You taught Blaubeer, or Bluebear as he became to be known, to hunt too, but his expertise was insects. He would bring in a bug when he could and announce its arrival. You taught him very well, and he was very proud of himself, I could tell. Then there was the more vegetarian phase you went through, in which I came downstairs one morning to look outside and noticed that you'd left me a little mouse. Except rather than a real mouse, this mouse was a cat toy, one in which we'd never bought for you. To this day, I don't know who or how you got it. I can only assume you discovered some other neighborhood cat store of toys, but day after day you kept turning up with these little toy mice. One toy bird, one baby soft toy, and it was at this point I had to question if our cat had become a kleptomaniac. Suddenly that habit disappeared as quickly as it had arrived, and never reappeared again. I have to assume that our kind but firm words did the trick. Or maybe the other cats ran out of toys. Another fun game we used to love to play was fetch. I can't quite remember how it started, but I came to realize that when there were plastic straws around, you enjoyed biting them. They seemed to move in a way that excited you, the way that other cats are with those plastic rods that have feathers attached to the end. You'd carry them around in your mouth proudly, like a dog would with a stick. So we started to throw them for you. Eagerly, you'd chase after them, returning to drop it at my feet or hoping that I'd wrestle you with it. Later on, you'd do something similar with hair scrunchies that I'd ping across the room for you, and it was a game that Blue also picked up on. There'd be mornings I was getting ready for work, and you or Blue would make a request for a couple of throws before I left. I did my best to facilitate, and you were always grateful. If I went to pick up the straw unprompted by you, I'd gasp, sucking in breath to indicate excitement, and you'd turn to see what I was going to do next. Alert and poised, whatever had caused me to gasp, you were ready. It's a method I'd use to get your attention or encourage you to focus, implying that something exciting was enough for a gasp meant that it was fun, and fun was inevitably going to ensue. There was one time, though, that fun occurred before the gasp. I came downstairs one morning after you'd discovered a box of neon colored party straws that we had to hide in a drawer to prevent you from getting to them. Clearly, we had failed. Somehow, you discovered the box and, in your excitement, opened it and played with them, all in the course of a night. You'd strewn them across the kitchen like a colorful confetti for me to discover when I finally decided to descend into the kitchen. Like a surprise party you'd thrown for me. It was a lot of straws to clean up, Ludo. But you had a wonderful time, though. We did our best to pass into a very homogeneous neighborhood when we moved to the Raadhuis. I tended to shy away a little. As a native English speaker, there were times it either fascinated people that I was British, and I started to feel like an alien who had somehow been able to slip under several radars, or it made other people, especially older people, seem a little uncomfortable. And so I left a lot of conversations to First Daddy. He seemed to quite like feeling like he slotted into the heartbeat of society in ways I couldn't really understand. But he was clearly approachable enough that those double his age and older felt that they could speak to him comfortably. We weren't disrespectful youths, we were a young married couple, and that I'm sure gave them feelings of nostalgia and brought back memories. So it wasn't so strange when we were approached by a neighbor who lived a couple of doors down. She generally had a sunny disposition, seemed to live alone, and I think enjoyed the occasional neighborly chat, but on this occasion she approached with a different type of energy. I need to talk to you about something. When I leave my living room door open in the summer, Ludo has a tendency to walk in like he owns the place. I think I need to start spraying him with a bottle of water to stop. A little shocked, we said we understood where she was coming from. I quite like the fella. He's not unfriendly and he doesn't misbehave, but you see, I'm allergic to cats. Our nodding picked up energy and we wanted to show solidarity and support the best way we could. Inwardly, I was questioning, how do I explain to this bold little creature that he cannot just walk into any home he likes? She continued, he quite clearly understands the layout of the house. He would. All of these neighborhood houses had been built more or less identically. The other day, she continued, I was home and I came upstairs. He was lying on my bed. I can only assume that he'd climbed through the second-story window, although how he got up there, I don't know. Hmm. We apologized profusely and insisted that if she continues to have problems, that she gives one of us a call and we will come over and solve the problem. For a moment, I was worried you might have to become an indoors cat again, which I'd learned after we moved into this place and had kept you inside a few days to prevent you from trying to run back to our old place. You had your own ways of making it very clear that you did not appreciate, nor would you accept being held hostage in your own home. You communicated by the way of dirty protesting, which you did every time we moved house, and you had to stay indoors for a few days. By the fourth home we lived in, you were at least courteous enough to dirty protest in the bathroom on the floor, much kinder than the time we'd moved to Ulvik, and you took to protesting in my unpacked suitcase of clothes. You knew your mind, and you knew how to make things clear to me. For that, sometimes I was horrified, but generally I was grateful. We weren't in that home for too long. After 2 years married, Daddy and I had realized that we weren't as compatible as we'd hoped. I struggled with his inability to communicate or talk about feelings, preferring to disappear into video games or other things to distract himself. He took issue with my lack of affection, my tendency to start hiding myself in mobile games. By this point, I'd started working as a games producer for a pretty popular title, and I'd brought myself a smartphone and started playing games by way of research and to fill in those little moments of boredom or distraction when having a husband who can't talk about his feelings made me feel very lonely. The relationship therapy I had suggested did not work out, and if I'm honest, possibly added more fuel to the fire, as she seemed rooted in her own conservative biases of relationships that left me feeling confused. I'd spoken about moving out and getting some space, but I'd also started spending less and less time at home, opting to work out, go to the gym, confide in my friend that maybe if I was just beautiful enough, he'd have to feel more strongly towards me and things would change. Later on, of course, I realized that despite societal rhetoric and a wealth of books and movies, this isn't exactly how things work. And having entered the adult world, growing up around parents who mostly bickered, argued, and gave each other silent treatment, took it out on people around them, I did not have a whole host of tools that I needed to better understand my own needs, let alone those in a relationship. Alas, at 26, I got divorced. And luckily, found out that a colleague was going to live in another location for work and was renting out his apartment. He agreed to rent it out to me, and I was allowed to bring my cats. Daddy stayed behind in our home, and whilst I'd offered to walk away and make a clean break, he said he'd rather sell the house, split the profit, and our stuff. And so I moved into this little apartment in Alvik, slept on a mattress on the floor, just had my laptop and my phone for company, but I started to feel better again. Rather than feeling invisible or ignored in my own home, I started being able to center myself. I realized that all the months I'd been staring at the walls at the weekend was because I was fatigued. I was trying to disappear, and it was something that I needed to start working with. I was still working out a lot with my friends, and so when I would go to work and be home, it required some organization on our part. You wanted to go outside in the mornings and come back when I got home, but possibly be outside even overnight, only to come back in for breakfast and for dinner, and thus repeat. Now, we had just moved from a Radhustrand apartment on the third floor of a building that was close to a patch of forest, a pub, a school, and an elderly people's home. When we did start going outside again together, we would talk through that patch of forest, you running at top speed with Blue at your side, up and down trees into long grass, and back towards the path. At first, you got a bit anxious when I was out of sight, and you made a pained meow if you'd run too far ahead and couldn't find me, to which I used to answer, Ludo Schmudo, which eventually turned into a similar sounding whistle, Ludo Schmudo. That became our whistle. And a whistle I was actually softly singing even in your last few hours, to try and remind you of those times together, our happy days. Something I did notice when we moved into a little home in Alvik is we'd gained a new type of bonding through running through the forest together with Blue Mushroom. There were days I didn't want to go and you did, and we'd maybe argue a little, but otherwise there were other lovely things that you started doing. Snuggling up with me on my mattress on the floor more often, and if we were somewhere else, making sure that you had some type of bodily connection before you fell asleep. So if I moved, you knew about it. I took so many silly photos of you falling asleep with one of your little paws just lightly touching my foot or my leg, just to make sure I wouldn't go anywhere without your knowledge. And I loved it. From feeling invisible, I now felt important, valid, and chosen. Continuing with our runs in the forest, our whistling and meowing communication system in place, I would start running ahead or hiding behind trees. The three of you running after me to catch up or coming to look for me. You were very good at finding me and then sitting and waiting for the others to catch up. Sometimes Mush would get a little nervous and start meowing, and I'd have to let her know I was nearby. She was safe. Sometimes she asked me to pick her up and carry her, and I didn't mind that at all. We often came across dogs being walked in the forest. Mush would either run back home in a panic or hide in some bushes, but close enough to watch, far enough away to be safe, or want to be picked up. On the other hand, You, I could often ask you to sit and wait for the dog to pass as long as you could see the dog was on its leash and predictable. Then you were cool as a cucumber. Now and again, there were some nasty dog owners claiming that my cats were the reason that they couldn't get their dogs under control, but they knew that was a steep claim and their responsibility. You were always pretty smart, trusting them enough, but not gullible. You knew that there were humans out there who couldn't always be trusted. And so for those 2 years, we would try and run through the forest a few times a week. Plenty of people approached me asking if the cats following me were in fact my cats, and amazed when you'd respond to whistles or come and join in the conversation. I felt like a cat whisperer. I'd walk through the forest talking to you out loud and unashamedly. Hey, I was a divorced 26-year-old with 3 cats. I felt like cool had never really been a label I'd opted for, but now I was clearly some Miss Havisham-esque crazy cat lady, the type I read about as characters that society refers to as unfortunate or unloved in heteronormative narratives that we choose to tell children. I did feel like there was something wrong with me, and that I was all of those things. But for a moment, I just felt like embracing it was more fun than being ashamed of it. It brought me back to my childish dreams of being able to speak to animals, and imagining that being an adult was about eating sweets and playing all day. And in those moments, it was. As I mentioned, there were times that I would get home a little later, whether because of work or gym, or perhaps I'd grabbed a quick social drink on my way home. I tried to be mindful that if you'd been out all day, not to let things get too late. I'd be considerate of needing to feed you, as even though you still caught mice, I'd rather you didn't feel the need. I remember there was one time I get off at the station, and as I started walking towards home, which was only 5 minutes away, I saw some young women gathered around, cooing and talking in a sweet way. I looked over to see you being surrounded by young women who were so impressed by how sweet and friendly you were. I'm not sure who was having the better time. I remember rolling my eyes to myself, and you spotted me, and you let out a really whiny meow. It was a "Where have you been all this time?" meow. "I've been waiting you for ages" meow. One I didn't hear too often, but you were very clear about its use there and then. I suggested that you "come on then," and to the young women's dismay, you jumped down and followed me home to be fed. After then, if I ever took too long to come home, I knew to look out for you at the station, and to expect you to whine at me all the way home. I won't lie, I loved it. Sometimes on our forest route, I would stop off at a little food kiosk and pick up something to eat. There was a lovely Thai restaurant run by a very friendly man. He saw that you would follow me, and he mentioned that he saw you around quite often. Sometimes I sat on the little picnic bench there to eat. Other times I took the food home with me. It was sort of like an opening from the forest, where there was a little path and some grass before the forest continued. On the other side of the street there were more apartments, some recycling banks, and again next to a grassy patch. I did notice that if you ever came with me to the recycling, there was a little gang of magpies who seemed to get very noisy as if to warn each other that you were around. I saw them chase you once. One of them flew overhead, and you ran back into the forest. I noticed later on at our next apartment, the magpies didn't like you there much either. I could never tell if they were the same magpies, as our new place was only a few kilometers away from the last. But when I left the balcony glass open for you overnight, with a bowl of biscuits for you to snack on, placed next to my bedroom, I'd wake up often to find a magpie had snuck in to eat your cat biscuits. If I made it clear that I was awake, the magpie would fly back out as quickly as possible. But where the glass was open, Some bird had marked the territory with bright white bird poo. Strangely, there was no bird poo anywhere else on my balcony ledge, or even on the balcony, despite the regular theft of cat biscuits. Just a line of about 50 centimeters by the glass opening. I didn't mind them popping in for a snack, as it was better than finding plastic bags of trash, which they like to do sometimes, tearing them apart to look for food. I was just also I was just always aware that the same chitter chatter that I observed as they were chasing you is what I would hear as they popped in. During our time in Ulvik, there were occasions where you'd be out for longer stretches, sometimes a few days at a time, and it worried me. I wondered if you were such a proficient hunter in the forest that you preferred to hunt than to come home to cat food. After the few days, you'd happily turn up, as if I hadn't been wondering where you got to, or if I needed to report you missing. You were chipped, and as we lived quite close by to a vet clinic, I wasn't too worried. I never got a call that anybody brought in a strawberry blonde beast, and you always came back after a few days, every time. I figured maybe you'd made a friend somewhere, whether cat or human, or otherwise given your history of stealing mouse toys from other cats. I was pretty confident that you were holding your own wherever you went. At that point, I was opting to walk into work a few times a week, which would typically take me an hour, but give me time and space to breathe some air and get my thoughts in order before a busy day. On one such journey, you tried to join me. I was worried I'd have to turn around and take you back to our apartment. Walking ahead of me, you would keep turning around to check that I was still following, and then you went off into a little cul-de-sac on a side quest. I stopped to see what you would do, as it was pretty clear that you only intended to follow me that far. When I didn't follow in after you, you came back out again, weaving around my legs, looking up at me lovingly, and then disappearing off into the premises of this other neighborhood. I figured that this was perhaps where your friend lived, but I didn't have time to follow you, as I was on my way to work. I managed to sneak away and on return decided to give it a bit of a proper look. I realized you'd been sneaking off into an elderly people's home. Now, I have no doubts that whoever you had befriended there was the reason you were not always coming home, and why would you? I bet you got spoiled in all manner of food and affection. 2 years later, when we moved to our apartment in Bromma, and Blue had run away for the second time, having turned up at our old apartment the first time, I went back to the elderly people's home to ask around. The first time he had run away, I'd gone back to check for him, to whistle for him, only to get a phone call eventually from a lady who lived up the road from our old place, who'd been feeding him and taking him to the vet's to get his chip checked. The second time, he'd sadly made a run for the hills whilst I was on a work trip. The person who had been letting you indoors and outdoors, as Blue was no longer allowed to freely roam after the first escape took 18 months to find him again, he'd taken the opportunity to run. Clearly, he had unfinished business in that place. Ultimately, it was where he turned up a second time. On this occasion, however, I decided to go into the elderly people's home and speak to one of the nurses, who confirmed that indeed there was a large black cat who came to visit the elderly residents, made a bit of a nuisance of himself. I gave her my number and left, although having found him not long after, and wow, had he put on a lot of weight. After the last escape, he'd definitely come home weightier than before he left, but this time he was even bigger, which made me wonder how many homes he was visiting for food and snacks. Having taken him home, and noticing some very strange behavior, I decided to take him to the vet for a checkup. He had developed a few strange looking bald patches, and it raised alarm. Imagine my surprise when the vet explained that this wasn't my cat. It certainly explained the strange behavior from both you and Mushroom, but I figured that could have been because he smelled strangely after having been living somewhere else. But no, this cat was a bona fide imposter, and I was in disbelief. Blue wasn't a black cat. He was smoky, which meant that in different lights you could see black brown markings, and if you parted his fur, it looked almost grey or white. This cat had the same two colors in his eyes that I hadn't seen so often before, green and yellow. We called this cat's real owner, who unsurprisingly lived in Alvik, and he came to pick him up. I mentioned the bald patches, to which he responded that their cat had gotten too overweight to groom himself properly, so they'd started cutting mats out of his fur. When Blue did finally turn up again, he was almost as large as that other cat. Given that they'd both been living in an area where there was clearly a lot of neighbors and elderly folks to visit, I suspect that they'd been running a bit of a doppelganger heist. Upon bringing him home again, life resumed back to normal, but he's still not allowed outside without accompaniment, and he really hates being on a leash. There was one time I was coming home from work as I normally would. I used to go through the back door, and I'd normally call for you to come home for dinner, as you preferred to spend your days outside with Blue Mushroom when she was feeling brave. From a distance, I could see somebody's daughter standing on the back step speaking to you. She cooed and awed and petted you, and you sat very still and focused on the back door itself. I did not recognize this young girl. She must have been about 10 years old with a rucksack on, perhaps the daughter of a new neighbor who'd moved in without me noticing. As I approached, she who had been sitting down asked me, "Do you know this cat?" I said, "Yes, I do. He's my cat." She continued to explain that she had met you in the forest, and that somehow you had convinced her to follow you home on the way back from school. She assumed that you wanted her to let you inside, but she hadn't come across anybody who lived there. I thanked her on behalf of you and I for clearly caring about your well being. As she left to go get home herself, I said she's welcome to visit him any time she likes, and that he often likes to play in the forest when I'm at work. She never came back again, which was perhaps for the better, but it amused me that whilst I'd heard cats bringing home mice and birds and maybe even the occasional rabbit, leaving them on the doorstep, was the first time I'd heard of a cat bringing home a little girl. I hope she's safe and well, and that she didn't make a habit of following strangers home. In years to come, I realized you had a habit for convincing humans to let you inside buildings. When we later moved to our home in Bromma, I would regularly have my doorbell rung by neighbors and strangers alike, who would ask me, "Is this your cat?" As you would run in after them as they opened the main door to our building and insist on staring intently at my front door until somebody rang the bell. Since starting my new job in January, there have been several occasions whilst working from home and sitting in a meeting in Zoom that my doorbell has rung. The people in the meeting, more often than not, can hear that there is somebody at my door, and as I quickly pop out, I have to explain, "I'm sorry, it's probably my cat." On returning, I have to then explain how my cat manages to ring the doorbell. I suppose it all sounds pretty unbelievable, but generally I've been given the benefit of the doubt. More confusing it is to the human standing at my door who does not know either of us, but somehow felt compelled to ring a stranger's bell to ask if this strange and stubborn little cat lives here. You definitely knew more of the neighbors than I did. Everywhere we lived. Second Daddy once took out the trash, and on returning, he mentioned he bumped into a neighbor outside. When you had decided it was time to come inside for dinner, she'd asked if you were his cat, to which he explained that you, of course, belonged to me. To this day, I have no idea who she was, and on many occasions in which I was meeting new neighbors, they'd all have a Ludo story, and they clearly knew you so much better than the human you lived with. When I wrote to inform my neighbors of your sad departure, as you were getting old and sick, I reflected that you never really belonged to only me, which is why I felt compelled to let people know that you weren't my cat, but I was your human, and I enjoyed that very much. We had moved to Bromma around midsummer 2017, and again we had to go through keeping you indoors until you were ready to accept that this was our new home. You made it clear that you did not approve of this, of course, but when I was confident that you had understood that this was our home now, you started going outside. Our building was newly built, and the third of five buildings in this complex that meant that it wasn't too busy when we first moved in. I was grateful for our home and the good times in Alvik, but I had been renting after the divorce, and moving to Bromma was a chance for me to rebuild some security. It was our home that I had bought for us. And with the exception of Blue, we seemed to settle in quite nicely. We were still in the habit of you going out the day, coming back when I got home from work, although you never did come to terms with the fact that there wasn't anywhere for us to run together at this new place. Many times you try and follow me away from the neighborhood, wanting to be a part of wherever I was going, and I had to find ways to sneak out one of the side doors from the courtyard and give you the slip. And I'd often hear you screaming at me in the distance, angry that I wasn't willing to take you with me to the supermarket or the station to work. There were a couple of times you outsmarted me, but this station was much busier than the last one, and near a busy road. So I think in the end, we both compromised. You were allowed to follow me as far as the pizzeria down the street, and I was allowed to continue walking away, knowing you'd likely scream at me for going, and sometimes wait there to scream at me on the way back, too. I saw in the local social media group one time there was a lady concerned about the strawberry blonde cat who sounded like he was screaming in pain and always seemed to be outside with no home, despite clearly looking very well fed and happy. I had been tagged, and I explained who you were, to be told snootily that it was not okay to let a cat outside. It was dangerous for the cat and for the wildlife. But you were always so good with cars. I had more concern about the meddlings of well meaning human beings than I did about you getting into a car accident. As for the wildlife, she was probably right. But as a cat that caught a lot of mice and not birds, I wasn't too concerned there either. On the other side of our apartment building, there was a stretch of grass and trees before you reach a gym that had an attached car park. There was one day I received a text message from an irritable ex daddy telling me I need to update the details on your chip, as he'd received a call from one of the workers at the gym. He gave me her number, and so I gave her a call. She mentioned that she had taken you to the vet to find out if you belonged to anybody, as you were often outside the gym greeting all the guests. They would remark how friendly and social you were, wondering if you lived nearby, to which now she had her answer. I apologized, and I said she could call me if she had any concerns or if there were any complaints. She then proceeded to ask if I had any plans to give you away, or that if the thought ever crossed my mind, I would let her know, as she'd fallen a bit in love with you. I expressed clearly that that was not on the cards, and that I agreed that you were a very special cat, and I'd let her know if anything changed. But I have to admit, it made me a little nervous. We didn't take that route too often together, and that was a direction I didn't want you to follow or go looking for me. I didn't want you to go there after that, and you seem to pick up on that. I don't think I ever saw you go beyond our complex in that direction again. Maybe you were also worried that the meddling humans would separate us. If I was outside, you always wanted to be a part of whatever I was doing. One of the things I came to learn about my neighborhood was that I was living amongst some pretty social people. One of the selling points of this apartment when I'd bought it was the little community outdoors pool, which was open to all of us that lived here in the summer. We were allowed to bring guests, and in Swedish fashion, there were rules to follow. One of the rules, no animals. And that was supposed to include you too, Ludo. I'm pretty sure that half of the time you seemed to think that you were just one of us. By which I mean, when I would pop into my neighbor's place with a bottle of cava in an evening or swing by for a chat during the day, you would insist on coming with me. Sometimes you were even there already before me. As many of the neighbors would often find you in the summer, whether they had cats of their own or not. Similarly, if I wanted to go to our little community pool, it's cordoned off by a metal fence, but you would slip through the bars. If you could hear my voice coming from that area, you'd squeeze through the bars to come and find me and be a part of whatever I was doing. I often had to leave and come and sit with you on the grass outside the pool area instead. Or, if I thought I could convince you to come home instead, I would try that. But you weren't stupid and you knew my games. As neighbors came and went, you updated your internal map as to whose balcony was worth visiting, whose wasn't. There were a couple of neighbors who were afraid of cats and who were really unhappy at the liberties you took being on their balcony. I saw one lady scream once as you walked by a little too close to her for comfort. So I would do my best to call you home quicker with our little whistle that I used to use in the forest in Alvik. There were other neighbors, however, who really enjoyed your visit, as I mentioned. One friend in particular really enjoyed the company and didn't seem to mind the fact that her home was also your home. If her balcony door was open, you might pop in to say hello, or she might find you sitting on her furniture outdoors. You were a welcome break, especially when many of us were working from home during the corona time. You'd pop around, check on people. You had your favorite spots and regular haunts. I know you used to pop over to see Ella the cat every day. Ella was a pedigree, and while she didn't seem to like you all of the time, you seemed to have a bit of a love-hate relationship with her. You loved her cat food, and she hated your intrusion. Ella's parents used to buy Ella the expensive cat food, so imagine my embarrassment when I discovered that you were regularly going over and not only stealing Ella's food, but asking for more. I apologized with a voucher to cover the cost of your appetite, but I know Fiona loved your visits. Their family came to say goodbye to you on your last day, as I warned them that you might have to go soon. They made sure that you had plenty to eat that day. Oh, and then there was Chris, another fancy breed of cat who seemed as volatile as he seemed angry. Didn't seem to like anybody, and I caught the two of you having a fight once. His owner, Alexei, didn't seem to mind that you were always using their balcony as a lookout point. They had a good view of the courtyard, but Chris didn't like it much. Given that you were a bit bigger and willing to insist, he seems to have concluded that he could see your perspective. Not that I approve, mind you. Chris, however, seemed to prefer to hang out in the stairwells of the buildings, hissing at anybody who wanted to go past him. And as he would often sit on the stairs to the second floor, somebody brought up once that he was a little temperamental to Alexei. Good, Alexei mused, and so was that. In our last apartment in Alvik, I lived on the third floor, which meant too often I had to coordinate when you wanted to go in and out. Never easy when cats are involved due to the indecisive nature that they are famous for. If there were times you wanted to come in, you'd let me know by meowing under my window. not stopping until I came down and opened the back door. Similarly, it was also how you let me know that you'd caught me a mouse, which meant that sometimes I would have to bolt out of bed, down the stairs at early hours, to prevent you from waking up the neighborhood. Loud and proud, you let me know, you knew how to let me know if your current plans did not fit our usual schedule. Sometimes, much to my annoyance. When we moved to our place in Bromma, you developed a new trick. Now that we lived on the ground floor and I could let you in and out through the balcony, you learned how to tap the glass when you wanted to come in. At first, it caused a bit of a shock. As a woman living on the ground floor, the last thing she wants is to hear at her bedroom window a gentle knocking. But I learned that that was your way of letting me know, and I went with it. Similarly, when you wanted to go out, you'd knock on my bedroom window and let and I would let you onto the balcony where I had to leave the glass open for you. You started getting into a habit of knocking for me in the middle of the night. And so, as long as there was a bowl of biscuits for a late night snack, you'd start to let me sleep. Similarly, you'd catch me mice, give me your famous loud and proud meow, drop them onto my balcony for me to deal with, in whatever state I met them in. The luxury caused me to get a little bit lazy, I confess. If there were nights you hadn't want to go outside, when I was going off to bed, I left you inside, to always be woken up a few hours later by your tap, tap, tap on the bedroom window to go out. At some point, I got fed up of letting you out in the middle of the night. If it was the summer and you were happy to be out, the Swedish winters, however, being as cold as they were, or are, and no elderly people's homes to visit, you often wanted to go out in the middle of the night for reasons I didn't understand. But not before you were ready. Not before I went to bed. A couple of times I tried to ignore you, hoping you'd forget about going outside and stay in as it was cold and I couldn't think of any good reason you needed to be out in the middle of the night in -degrees. If it got too cold, you tended to accept my decision, but you'd look outside, whipping your tail around in annoyance, sulking, especially if there was snow. You hated snow, but if it was around 0 and you hadn't gone out, I knew you were going to tap, tap, tap at some point between about 1 and 5 in the morning. As I mentioned, I did try ignoring it a few times, hoping you'd forget about it, or give me at least until 6 or 7 before you insisted. But after me doing that a few times too many, you found that if you jumped on top of me whilst I was sleeping and ran across me, I was normally so shocked into waking, so suddenly, I was very willing to let you outside, to then be able to get back and recover my warm and sleepy state. So that's what you started doing. If I slept too late in the morning, or you were inside and I was still asleep, I'd feel you land on me with a sudden thump, and ran with quick little pitter-patter paws before I could react, ideally across my stomach, as that forced me to sit up. You brute. So I started closing my bedroom door so you couldn't get in to disturb me. Once you realized my shut bedroom door was an attempt to keep you out, you started knocking on the door as you did the window. Although it was more of a stroke, stroke, stroke of the door. Later on, when Kira and Balana came to live with us, you taught them how to do it too. But I could always tell when it was you because of the pace and intensity of your little knocks. But ultimately, I never got a lie in again. As I've mentioned a few times, you were a fantastic hunter. Whilst I don't tend to like you glorifying death and killing, I was grateful that you protected me from insects. and seemingly you kept on top of our neighborhood mouse problem. I rarely saw any in nearly 6 years. The one time I did feel a little out of my depth, though, was when you brought me home a particularly large mouse. Typically, your catches were between about 5 to 10 centimeters, excluding tail, field mice. But there was a time I thought there was a second cat on my balcony. I had to look online to see if it was a rat, and to this day I'm not entirely sure. But I saw you turn up and make your usual loud and proud to see something of about 25 centimeters hanging from your mouth, excluding the thick rubbery tail, and I wasn't going to just open up and let you in until I knew that it was not going to run in after you. When you realized this, you dropped it in front of the door where it slumped like a sack of potatoes with its thick earthworm like tail trailed behind it. Now, I have never been afraid of mice. And when we lived out in the summer shack, we managed to get on with an uninvited lodger for a time. But even then, I originally tried catching it by propping up a plastic bowl, placing down some bait in a way that the bowl should drop and catch it, uh, and release it back outside. Something I had learned from growing up watching cartoons in the 90s. Needless to say, it didn't work. In the end, we had to concede to a more violent form of mousetrap, which was a sad affair that you needn't worry yourself with. On this occasion, however, even though I could now see that it was very much dead, I was reluctant to take the usual inside out plastic bag method to try and pick it up and throw it in the outside trash chute. Every time I imagined doing it, I got shivers and repulsion running through my body. I found myself becoming highly irrational, questioning if it was still warm, imagining it might wake up from some fright induced coma, causing me to panic and drop it, where it would scurry into my apartment and ruin my life. For some reason, I decided that I was going to stream this event online for my friends and family. I think being able to turn it into a gory event in which others might see me as a way of forcing myself into more rational behavior, as I would not want to embarrass myself, but also secretly feeling somewhat braver with people seeing this beastly event rather than just explaining it afterwards. Hello, welcome. I've noticed that on several occasions that the line between anxiety and excitement can be an incredibly fine one, and perhaps trying to force my feeling from one camping to the next, this would resolve itself much quicker. Can't remember what time of year it was, but I was cautious to try and clean away any gifts you had left me as soon as possible. As there had been one summer, it had taken me a couple of days, and the result of the heat on half a mouse and its entrails is not something I'd like to describe in detail. But the thing that bothered me afterwards was that somehow it had stained the concrete it sat on. No amount of scrubbing with chlorine seemed to solve that, and after the horrific event of disposing of the body and any connected evidence, I made sure to let my neighbors know through an online group we had. If this was a rat, it was not a problem I took lightly, and whilst I made sure to tally the regularity of the mice turning up to make sure nothing seemed like it was getting out of hand, generally the neighbors seemed pretty quietly appreciative that you were handling the situation. I was the local mortician. I'm not sure if any other neighborhood cats were catching anything. I did ask, just as my cat was coming home with so many mice, but I never got a response. Possibly they did not want to embarrass their counterparts, their feline counterparts. I certainly never witnessed any other cats' louds and prouds. I will stop here. I am halfway through.